I will now call to order tonight's meeting of the Evanston Preservation Commission. We have a quorum of 8. Yes, 8 commissioners present. Oh, Charles is not? Oh, he just isn't here right now. Okay, so we have a quorum of 9 commissioners present. The City of Evanston's Preservation Ordinance empowers this body to oversee and administer the community's historic preservation program. During our monthly public meetings, we encourage public participation, afford due process through public hearings on proposed landmark designations and applications for certificates of appropriateness, and discuss ways to advance long-range planning goals beyond case review. We ask anyone who wishes to address the Commission to sign in and indicate the discussion item, designation, or application to be addressed. The first order of business tonight will be public comment on items listed under discussion on the meeting agenda. For old and new business, I will ask staff to read each case into the record. Once a case has been read into the record, the applicant presents an overview of the proposal, including evidence and testimony that supports the applicable review standards being met. Commissioners will then ask questions of the applicant with specific attention to the review standards as required by the ordinance. Following the questioning period, members of the public may speak toward the application, keeping their comments to 3 minutes or less. Following public comment, the applicant will have the opportunity to respond to any evidence or testimony against the application as it relates to the review standards. The Commission then closes the record and proceeds to deliberation and a motion to approve the proposal or approve with conditions. A simple majority of the quorum present is required for a motion to carry. After old and new business conclude, the Commission considers the previous public meeting's minutes and then discusses actions pertaining to long-range planning goals. First item on the agenda is public comment. Is there anyone here from the public wishing to speak? Did we get any comments online? Okay, seeing none, we have an unusual agenda tonight. We have the next in our speaker series, Landmarks Illinois Relevancy Project. We have Bonnie McDonald, President and CEO of Landmarks Illinois. Let me just say that her full bio is in the agenda, and I want to add a personal comment that I find Ms. McDonald to be a tireless advocate for equity and in preservation, and I'm so grateful that she is here with us tonight. So thank you very much. Go ahead and you can start speaking when you are ready. We have your presentation up, and then we'll ask you some questions after you're done. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Chairperson Dreller, for the invitation, and to Kate as well. I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak before a commission where I've been at the dais several times, but not able to speak in a theoretical way about preservation. Oftentimes this is about advocacy, and in one way, shape, or form, this is about advocacy about preservation, but it's really a conversation about the future of preservation and how you, as oftentimes the first people that a person will meet to encounter preservation, the opportunity that you have to help them through this process, to make it more accessible, and also, I think, to make it more relevant to more people as well as we think about that. So that's the focus of the Relevancy Project, and I'm excited to talk to you tonight. We have a limited amount of time and want to allow for at least 10 minutes for question and answer. So to begin, thank you. My name is Bonnie McDonald. As the chairman noted, I'm the president and CEO of Landmarks Illinois, which is the statewide historic preservation nonprofit organization. We are a 50-plus-year-old nonprofit organization that has served the entire state of Illinois since 1979 as well. And we have often worked side by side with you all as commissioners to understand how we can help people understand this process, move through it, and preserve the places that are important to them. That's what we want preservation to be, is to identify the places that are meaningful to communities and to individuals, that tell their stories, that tell how we came to be, that help us understand the fuller history of our nation, of the places that we live, and also that are about our identity as well, who we are as a people, and what we have to tell for the future. As Commissioner Smith and I were talking about, preservation is far more about the future than it is about the past. And so that's what I'm here to speak about tonight. So Cade, you're going to forward the slides for me. I appreciate it. So I'll go to the second slide, honestly, to begin to set the table for this conversation. And you may recognize this is your room right here. This is the Evanston Preservation Commission meeting in 2018 as we were having a very public conversation about the Harley Clark Mansion. And of course, that conversation is continuing with great public input about what can be done and what will be done in the future of that place. But at the time, this was a conversation about the proposed demolition of the Harley Clark Mansion. And I bring it as an illustration of what we, Landmarks Illinois, were seeing all across the state and what we were hearing from our colleagues all across the nation as well. So at a time when we have been doing a formal preservation program in this nation for more than 60 years at this time, we were seeing a constant pushback against preservation ordinances by city councils, by county commissioners. The proposed devaluing of preservation incentives. In 2017, just a year before this, there was an effort to do away with the federal historic tax credit in Congress. There were efforts to de-designate historic properties, entire historic districts. And here again, this was an indication where we had the opportunity to talk about the future of this home, and we're fighting against unfortunately, the perception that this was not an asset to the community, it was a liability. This is a designated historic resource owned by the city of Evanston itself, and there was a proposal to demolish its own landmark. I think it was just indicative of how we saw that a conversation needed to happen about how people saw our historic resources and how, at least in our state, we had an opportunity to really understand how we could do better in preservation, to evaluate what we are presenting to our community, how people navigate this process or don't, and what we needed to do to change preservation to make it more relevant. So, Kay, the next slide, please. This was an indication, and I think the Relevancy Project was really an effort to identify how we could make preservation more relevant to more people. Now, perhaps the grammar's not great on that, but essentially that's what we're trying to do, is how do we make this work of the places of identity, the places of our history, the places of cultural meaning in our communities, to connect it more with people's lives. And essentially, what do we mean by relevance? I just want to define that for you, that something is relevant to a person when they connect with it, when they see it as significant to their life, when it connects with something that's real to them, and that they care about it. That is when something is relevant to them. And I would argue that there are places in people's everyday lives, historic places, that are truly relevant, but we may not be telling a story that helps people understand how it's meaningful to them. Because the story that we tell in preservation oftentimes is just about the architecture. And I know that Commissioner Cohen and I have had many conversations about historic architecture, but oftentimes people feel like outsiders while they're standing at this dais because they don't speak the language of architecture. They may not understand the history because you oftentimes can't see that history. Unless we help people to do the research or understand that history, it is not clear, it is not something we can oftentimes observe. So that is the birth of the Relevancy Project. Next slide, Kate, thank you. Was actually to get back to the basics about preservation. So as you all are doing your job here, you are following the ordinance that you were given, which is tied to the Secretary of the Interior standards, and that is essentially the preservation program that we have built. But if you look back to the start of preservation in the 1966, the National Historic Preservation Act, which essentially codified how we were going to do this work to help people save places, this is from the report that led to that piece of federal legislation. This was a report by the mayors, the U.S. Conference of Mayors in 1966, as they were evaluating how to address urban renewal and what urban renewal was doing all across the country, which was destroying our historic cities in many ways, destroying our history. And they went to Europe to study how Europe was rebuilding from World War II. And why this is significant, why I bring it back to this, is if you read this language, you'll see a very important statement here that preservation is not here to be the cult of antiquarians. That we are here to use these places to provide a sense of orientation to our society. That preservation cannot be about the bricks and mortar. That we are here to essentially help people to tell their stories and to understand how to navigate the future by understanding the past. So it's very important. We're not here to revere a few precious shrines, that it must be an attempt to give a sense of orientation. So if you think about the way that we've set up preservation 60 years now, it's very much about the bricks and mortar. It's very much about the material. It's about the architecture and the design and how we think about integrity of those pieces and if they can still tell their story, if there's enough history there to tell the story. And this project is all about arguing the story is there. And that instead of focusing on the material, we need to focus on helping people tell their stories and to do a better job of that. So next slide, Cade. As we were considering how we could do our part to evolve the preservation movement, essentially we went out to talk with other people. Were they seeing the same thing that we were seeing in other communities and other states and other places around the nation? And we decided to go and talk with many people, and it ended up over about an 18-month period. I had the opportunity through a wonderful fellowship from the James Marston Fitch Charitable Foundation to talk with 130 people inside preservation, so the people who work like Cade, who does this work professionally, also advocates, people who work in sustainability, people who work in affordable housing, who are tangential to preservation, to understand what they were seeing about this work that we're doing as well. We needed to reflect back on what we see about ourselves. And after these 130 conversations, there were also 2 surveys that verified what I was hearing over and over and over again. So there was a survey done in 2019. This, by the way, started in August of 2019. So the National Trust for Historic Preservation did a survey in 2019, and 92% of preservationists who responded, of the 1,000 preservationists that responded, wanted our work to be more fair and equitable. 96% wanted to ensure that we were telling a more complete American story. And then that was verified again by a study done by the University of Pennsylvania that was published in 2022, which was about 2,000 preservationists who responded equally that we needed substantial change if preservation was going to be relevant in the future. And you might ask, does that really matter? It doesn't matter if preservation is relevant to people. I would say yes, because if you want to do this work in community with people and ensure that they can determine what's important to them, we need to ensure that we're making this work understandable and that we will continue to exist. Because if we don't have the political support, the incentives to move forward, preservation will not continue to exist in its current form. So we must do the change work ourselves. And that's what these surveys continue to demonstrate. There is broad understanding that we need to change preservation, and the question is how. So this has turned into an exploration of how we're going to change preservation, and I'm happy to answer your questions. So next slide, Cade. There were 8 common areas that continued to come up amongst the surveys and these conversations. So very quickly, they fall into these categories. So about accessibility and how we make people the focus of preservation instead of the material. That seems completely antithetical to what we know of preservation, but truly it needs to be about the people and the stories. That our work needs to be just and equitable and accessible and have self-determination by communities, and that this work can be truly meaningful when we're actually meeting people's needs, like providing affordable housing, like ensuring that we're addressing climate change through preservation, that we're doing a better job of telling stories through our historic places. As we think about reparations, these stories can also be about repairing at the same time. So these areas that I've underlined actually reinforce the work that you've already done on the Preserve 2040 plan. So I'm going to focus on those 4 areas, but I'd say please ask me about the other 4 that I won't be talking about today, since we have a pretty limited amount of time. So the 4 areas I'm going to touch on would be those areas in the 2040 plan: climate resilience, affordability, equitable and equity, and education. So next slide. Very quickly focusing the first on climate change, that, this existential problem, the greatest challenge we've ever faced as a human society, that 57% of people who live in the United States have never known anything but a warming climate. The climate has been warming consistently since 1976, and we're seeing the impact of that in weather events all across the globe. In a 2021 Gallup poll, 65% of Americans said they'd worried a fair amount to a great deal about global warming, and 64% believe human activity is to blame. So I'd say that is a majority. This is not debatable. A majority of Americans believe this to be true, and that 61% of people think that government needs to be doing more. So that is you. That is the work of the City of Evanston to continue with your effort to do climate resilience through preservation. Some more numbers for you, just to put this in context, is that 27% of global carbon emissions are coming from building materials, and another 13% from actual operational carbon. That's 40% of all carbon emissions are coming from buildings, the built environment. So we are the largest contributor in the world from our built environment. And we have the opportunity to do more, because preservation, we talk about it being the greenest building is the one already built. But when you look at the science, we can do far more. We can ensure that our buildings are more energy efficient, and that has to do with the work that you are doing. So, for example, if you look at the photo on the left, is an energy audit that was done of a historic home in Chicago, and you can clearly see there are some hot spots in it, presumably around the openings. So we talk about saving historic windows when, in fact, it may not be the best approach for energy efficiency to save all of our historic windows. We should look first at saving the material that we have. That is important. But we also need to talk about what can we do to ensure all of these buildings are doing the utmost to ensure that our climate does not continue to warm. How are we going to address that? And that's going to be an inconvenient truth as we approach also putting solar panels on the roofs of our buildings, when sometimes the best place to put them is on the front of the building. Now, I would say put them on there, because we want historic places to be seen as part of the climate solution, and we're never going to create the same environment that people walked into when that building was built. We are trying to create a fiction that doesn't exist. Instead, why can't we do something like California, where here in California, this is an historic district, as you can see, that's on the front face of the building. And the legislation in California states that essentially if you want to put a solar panel on something, you don't have to go through a review process, even a historic review process. Now, that's pretty extreme for us here in Illinois, but that is the extent to which California sees that environmental sustainability is of the primary importance, even above thinking about the historic character of the building. So we need to think about renewable energy sources and making sure that historic places are seen as part of the solution, not part of the problem. Next slide, Kate. With regard to thinking about the diversity, equity, and inclusion in preservation, this is a serious area where we need to do everything that we possibly can to ensure our historic places are telling the full story of the United States. There's a statistic that the research that was done in 2014 by the National Park Service found that only 8% of the buildings listed in the National Register of Historic Places told the story of people of color, women, and the LGBTQ community combined. 8%. So we have a long way to go if we're going to tell the full story. So I bring some photos up for you here. This is a project we had the great opportunity to work on in a little village in Chicago, where the community called us to ask for assistance with doing a building assessment of the Arco de la Valita, the arch of Little Village, and providing a resource that was needed and seen as needed for a place that's significant to the community. Instead of us coming and saying what's important, the community itself is identifying what's important to them. This was built in 1991 by a Mexican architect. And so in our traditional 50-year approach, this wouldn't have been seen as significant. But the city of Chicago, it's one of the newest Chicago landmarks that exists because the community brought it forward as something significant. And on the right-hand side, the Sheldon Peck Homestead, I bring this up because this has been evaluated for addition to the National Register of Historic Places, and so far has been determined that it is not eligible because of so many changes to the building. Why this is significant is that it's associated with Sheldon Peck and Harriet Peck, who were abolitionists, and this was a stop on the Underground Railroad. This is on the Network to Freedom, and it's still determined ineligible for the National Register of Historic Places because it's been changed over time. So how are we addressing the fact that buildings do change over time, and that this is part of telling their overall story? It doesn't mean that we can't understand the history. We just need to be better about telling that history. Continuing on, Cade, trying to manage time as well as I can, that affordable housing, your priority is affordability. I'm going to talk about affordable housing because, once again, much like climate change, this is seen across the board as a need in the United States. A majority of Americans see housing affordability as a problem. That's in rural, suburban, and urban America. In fact, 40% of rural residents that were surveyed felt affordability was a problem. 46% of suburban communities and 63% of urban residents feel that housing affordability is a major problem. So I would just say this is a great opportunity because we know historic resources are adaptable. They're, in fact, often easily adaptable for residential resources. So here I give you two examples that come from very close by here. This is the Maywood Senior Living facility that's getting an award from us in Maywood, the former Baptist home that was turned into senior affordable housing. On the right-hand side is a former high school, the Tiger Senior Apartments in Paris, Illinois, population about 8,000 people. And many, in fact, the residents living there went to high school there and are living in their classrooms and really enjoy this. So just to say that as you think about what you can do from a policy standpoint, you could look to Los Angeles and the Affordable Requirements Ordinance here, but also the Adaptive Reuse Ordinance in 1999 that they passed, which made it much easier to go through the process to adapt a building. They've created 46,000 housing units in downtown Los Angeles by reusing existing buildings. And in fact, Yardi Matrix, who's a firm that studies commercial building rehabilitation, found that 65% of the nearly 1,000 commercial buildings that were reused, historic buildings reused, created about 100,000 housing units. So we can really make a dent in the need for affordable housing by reusing existing buildings. Next slide. I'll just end on the educational opportunity that you have, since education is an important approach for you all, that you do the historic building review, and oftentimes it doesn't allow enough time to do some of the other educational work that you could possibly do. So I wanted to bring up for you the opportunity here. On the right-hand side, the New York City LGBTQ History Sites Project is about helping people see LGBTQ history in New York City, where it was oftentimes hidden because it was not safe to identify LGBTQ sites at one time in our history. So this is helping to bring that history forward to connect with new generations in New York City, and help them to understand the history of the LGBTQ community in New York City. And we have the same history here in Chicago. I just brought the Henry Gerber home forward. This is, pretty, I think beautiful yet nondescript residence. You would walk right by it and not know that this is a National Historic Landmark, because it is the place where the first nonprofit to protect gay rights was started in the entire nation in 1924. The the Society for Human Rights was started here by Henry Gerber. He was arrested for doing that work. So once again, we need to educate people because you can't see this history. So the commission has a great opportunity to be an educator as well, to do more historic research, to be able to tell these stories, to do data mapping, to help people, to take people on historic sites tour, to tell a full history. And to work in ways like the San Antonio Historic Preservation Commission, which has everything from a Living Trades Academy to a cultural heritage symposium to deconstruction ordinances. There are many that you can look to understand what other commissions are doing as well to connect with your Preserve 2040 plan. So I would say next slide. There will be additional information coming forward for you to use as models. If you're thinking, where do we begin with this? The results of all of this research over the past 4 years are coming forward as a book published by Landmarks Illinois in the next 2 months. And it has 2 appendices that list about 500 ideas for how we can change preservation, and then an equal amount of resources so you can also look at models from around the country. So it's not just we're calling for change, we actually have ideas coming from the field about how to do that change and models that you can look to at the same time. So at this time, I want to open it up for question and answer, and thank you for the time. Chair Dreller, how much time do we have for Q&A?
I would say at least 10 minutes. We can go longer if we need to.
All right. Do you have any initial questions? This is a lot to take in because it's really challenging traditional ideas of what the focus of preservation should be in some regards, or what people thought was a traditional idea. But if you go back to the With Heritage So Rich and thinking about the orientation to society and our role to not be the cult of antiquarians, what does that say to you? What does it speak to you? Are there any of these ideas that you find are really resonating with you?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, first of all, this was a great presentation. Thank you.
Thanks.
I feel like you've blown my mind a little bit. I'm like, oh man. But you mentioned the guidebook. When that's coming out, you said? Soon? Is that, because it sounds like you have a lot of ideas. Are those like, because for me, I would want to know like the best in class across the country. It sounds like you've pointed some out, but that's the kind of thing in the guidebook, it sounds like, with the resources and the ordinances that you cited, things like that we could reference?
Yes, thank you for the question, Commissioner. The guidebook is essentially seen as what is hopefully a one-stop resource for you because it includes, and if I may for just a moment tell you how this is going to be organized when it comes out, and hopefully the next month to 2 months it will be published as a digital resource on our website, which is landmarks.org, and it's free for download for anybody because we see this as a resource that we want to share with everybody and anybody. So the way that it's organized is essentially with a 4-page executive summary that people can hand to a city council member to easily understand what we're talking about. There are also 4-page guides that summarize all of this with resources, with model projects, and with 10 points about why we need to change these things that you can also hand to a city council person. There are essays that go into more depth about things. And then what is going to be most helpful, and I've shared a preliminary version of this with Cade as well as the chair, there are 2 appendices. One has the list of ideas coming from the 130 people that I spoke to, as well as their contacts. There are incredible resources in our own field, and there's no common place where we find them. I would say that's one of the biggest areas of improvement that we need in our field, is there's no one place that we can go to find these ideas where everybody is sharing things. So you have the commissions, you have the nonprofits, you have the consultants, and they're all doing different things and not necessarily talking with one another. So the list of ideas is about 500 within each one of these 8 categories. And then there's a list of those model projects so that you can go to the San Antonio website to find this. You can go to the City of Seattle has a very innovative program called Beyond Integrity, where they're thinking about how to look at what a community wants instead of focusing so much on the material aspect. So how do you bridge that gap between what the ordinance calls for you to do and what community residents want? Because many of these properties have changed over time. I would just say you probably have people coming in they've been maintaining buildings for 40, 50, 60 years. But when they're providing that kind of maintenance, they were doing their best to provide what they could. But it may have actually jeopardized what we would call the integrity, and how offensive it is to somebody to come before a commission with a building you love and be maintained over time, and to be told that it's not significant because we pick winners and losers in history, whether it was or was not saved in a particular way. So there's, I think, such broad thinking we need to do, and there are those that are already doing it. Yeah.
So, hi. So, I found your reference to Los Angeles particularly important, this idea of taking buildings and reusing them for affordable housing. I feel like that's a big issue here in Evanston, having affordable housing. So the question, there's adaptive use and then there's preservation. So I wonder if the idea of adaptive use came up in your conversations with people, where it's a little bit more open about what can be done. I don't know if maybe you could give us a few more details about what they're doing in Los Angeles.
Yes. Certainly. Happy to answer that question in two ways. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Do you go by chairwoman or chairperson? Chair. All right. Madam
Just
Chair.
called chair.
Chair. Two ways to think about this. The first is to directly answer the question about the adaptive reuse ordinance. So as I mentioned very quickly, I was trying to go through some of these models. So that was passed in 1999 because there was essentially an emptying out of the commercial buildings in downtown, as we're seeing in other communities, and a desperate need, as it continues in Los Angeles, a desperate need for affordable housing, for transformational housing, as the unhoused population needs additional assistance. How do we provide housing as quickly as possible? And you can get a housing unit to market much more quickly when you reuse an existing building. You can get it, the data is there from the Housing and Urban Development Department, that it is much more expedient to actually reuse an existing building to get affordable housing to the market. So that just demonstrated that the adaptive reuse ordinance was a way to get properties to the market faster. And if the city made it easier to do that, it was even faster. So I would just call that ordinance out because it streamlined the permitting process, as I understand it. It streamlined the building code and how one was looking at the building code, the fire code, and permitting to ensure that everyone had a consistent idea, was on the same page about essentially how to adapt these places in a safe way for the residents, but to do so in a quick way for the developers as well to get it to market. I want to pull back. The second piece of that is you were asking the question, adaptive reuse in some ways and preservation, or versus, and what are we talking about? And I think that's where we get into some of the jargon of preservation, because if you're watching on screen and you say, well, what's the difference between preservation and adaptive reuse? Aren't they one and the same? I think the general public would say that's all, it's all preservation. Restoration, reuse, preservation, doesn't matter. It's all about how we reuse places in a sustainable way, to tell stories, to help people through this process so that they can use the incentives that assist them. People need the resources to do this kind of work. So to me, we need to pull back from thinking about which standard we're using, because that's really difficult for people to navigate and understand. So I would hope that could be your conversation in thinking about, does the City of Evanston want to continue to use the Secretary of the Interior standards as your guide, or to develop something that's uniquely yours, that is going to help people through this process? As one of the most progressive communities in the country, the first to have a reparations process, how does preservation work into that as well? I'm not sure that I answered that question. The big picture is that we need to de-jargon preservation.
The context is that some of the architecture schools are moving away from the terminology of preservation and moving towards adaptive use as a way to get young people interested in the field. So that's why I thought maybe I would bring that up as a point of conversation.
Yes, Chair, I'm glad that you did, because there is, I would say, a far greater understanding when you talk about adaptive reuse or repositioning, that those words are more understandable than if we talk about restoration, renovation, that I have found, that especially in the development community, that adaptive reuse is more acceptable in some ways than thinking about the formal capital P preservation. Thank you.
Hi.
Commissioner.
So, yeah, I think what we were, oh, sorry, is this better? Okay. If you think about it, the buildable lots in Evanston, there aren't many buildable lots that are currently empty or available for new construction. So I guess that's what you were talking about. And then also the statistic that you gave, that almost slightly more than a quarter of greenhouse gas is coming from the construction industry. So, I mean, that's pretty a damning statistic right there, that, you know, it's like that industry needs to reform. And so, you know, we have existing building stock in our community, and part of our long-range plan is to potentially get more people involved in the preservation ethic. But, you know, I mean, now you're talking about preservation versus adaptive reuse. How do we, you know, take that jargon away, but then build the tent, you know, and include more people in that conversation?
Thank you, Commissioner Klein. That is an excellent question. That is very murky, and that I would say that hopefully this project, as well as several others that are doing this kind of work around the country, we are not alone in exploring this idea. The challenge we're giving ourselves is to look inward to understand what we need to change within our own field, instead of identifying what other people need to do and how they need to think about preservation. It's what do we do to understand what we need to change. Your bringing that statistic back is so important, because one of the statistics I didn't get to cite was essentially we have 110 million buildings in the existing buildings in the United States. About 100 million of them are housing, and a majority of those will still be in operation over the next 40 years. So if we would think about our operational carbon, that's a significant number of buildings that we have that will still be in operation, where we need to think very progressively, I would say, about how to ensure they're energy efficient, and that we are embracing green energy so that we decarbonize them, and then we decarbonize them within the building as well, so that we keep people safe as we button up historic buildings and make them tighter with insulation or with new windows, new doors, if that's the case. That we also need to ensure people are safe, and that is about removing fossil fuels from inside the building and ensuring they're vented correctly. These are all things the Commission can do to help people navigate that process. They need to have somebody they can trust, because not every contractor is well versed in how to do this work, and we need to keep people safe. So I would say that, you know, building a bigger tent is really about ensuring that we're working on the things that are meaningful to people. Houses are meaningful to people. Climate change is meaningful to people, because these are existential threats or things that are very challenging, or thinking about how to make sure this work is telling the full story in the process. And all of these things are ways that people will feel welcome and included, and that they belong. Because right now, when we talk about design and architecture, it's a language that not everybody speaks, and you easily feel like an outsider in this process. We want people to feel like an insider in this process. Commissioner, do you want to ask any follow-up question to that?
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think also there's a lot of preconceived notions that people have about what a preservation commission is, and you know, they're kind of scared to come before the commission. Are we going to tell them they can't paint their house pink, or things like that, or and as we're trying to look at more culturally significant places, or places that are not significant in the terms of material or architecture, I think that's more important, is trying to get people aware that sometimes they're a preservationist before they even know that they are, because they're, they love their house and they want to make sure it's, standing and well insulated. So I think, just getting to that point of helping people understand that.
Yes, Commissioner, thank you for that, because there is a perception, not that there isn't reality in it, but there's a perception that you're coming before a commission that is going to tell you no to whatever you're proposing, which is not the case. Most permits are approved and approved without major conditions added to them. So it is not that there isn't a perception issue. There certainly is, that we need to change the reality by talking more about the work that you do. I think being more in the public and expressing how this commission helps people to do this work as well, how you're a resource, how you're an asset, because not everybody has an architect that they can go to. Not everybody has a contractor who knows what they're doing. You can be a resource as public servants.
Sarah. Thank you. I think the presentation was really refreshing, and I think that what you're presenting is essentially a new definition of what preservation constitutes. And one of the things that I think is laudable about the Evanston Preservation Commission is that over the years there are standards that depart from the Secretary of the Interior standards and essentially ask for what we finally issue, which is a certificate of appropriateness. And the standards essentially ask that work that be done to historic buildings recognize what is unique about those buildings, accept the fact that for buildings to continue and have usable extended lifetimes, they do need to be modified, but that those modifications are always appropriate.
Yes, thank you very much, Commissioner Cohen. That question that I think, have the opportunity to ask ourselves is, who defines what's appropriate? Who is involved in that process? You are obviously here as a body to serve as the, in a way, the arbiters of what is appropriate. And I think that is such a responsibility to understand how you go through that process, who's involved in that. The Secretary of the Interior standards, which is one way that, that many commissions have used that standard, and they are actually quite flexible. It is how they are interpreted. It is not the standards that are usually the complication, it's the criteria when thinking about how to evaluate a historic place, to understand if it is has enough significance to be designated. But usually the criteria that's the hardest is the integrity criteria and how that's evaluated. So just the power that you all have here to determine what is and is not considered to be historic and what happens after it is determined to be or not to be. It's a very serious responsibility that you have, because these are people's lives, their stories, their homes, that as I go further and further down this journey or rabbit hole, whatever you would consider, that the more and more you understand how place is about people's identities, and that is something to take great care with, because our stories are essentially who we are as a people.
I have one more thing. I was just curious if you address anything about like landscaping and trees. And I know there's a lot of, with historic homes, there's a lot of large 100-year-old trees. I know in Evanston there was like a tree ordinance. It didn't reside with us. It moved to the city council. But I'm curious if you address any of that in your guide, or if you had any thoughts around that, because it's usually part of these properties. And sometimes we have a brush with these issues, but we don't really have any jurisdiction over them, and I'm just wanting your thoughts on that, like in the context of climate change and
Certainly,
et cetera, yeah.
Certainly, Commissioner. I do not have a specific section that addresses trees in particular. There are some references to cultural landscapes in here as we think about what is a cultural landscape. But what I would say is that you may have been watching the news recently about the tree that was cut down in England. And I think that is an indication of how meaningful that's just another place. It is, a tree is a story. It's a connection. It's an asset, a resource. It's just the same as a building can be, or a landscape can be, as we were talking about. That these are essentially the places that are connecting us to our memories. And that can be long memory, generations in this particular case with that tree in England. But we also have the opportunity not only to think about them as cultural assets and storytellers in their own right, but as part of our sustainability mission, and how we should always think very carefully about removing any material that's already been taken from the earth. That's the sustainability approach to preservation. And I think we need to think the same about trees and the urban canopy, because it provides essentially the ability to stop the heat island effect as well. So how do we take all of this into consideration? Because we silo ourselves in preservation in our one little lane, where I hope that the commission will take this conversation wherever you will, but that you'll use it to go and talk with other commissions, that this is a great opportunity to take this information and partner with the Human Rights Commission to think about how to go to the Parks Department. How do we make ourselves a solution provider? Because the reason we're not at the table is we're not seen as part of the solution. That's that appearance that we're the culture of no. And so we would be at the table more if we were seen as being a part of the solution, but also, I think, identifying that there's more compromise in preservation that we can bring to the table.
For the record, I wanted to just add that there is some language about a heritage tree ordinance potential in the Preserve 2040 plan, in case anyone is interested in taking that up. Did you have a question over there?
Yeah, I have a couple questions, and loved your presentation, and I've been sitting here trying to think of, I have so many questions of how to make them succinct and which ones to ask. I think I totally agree with, and I think we had a lot of discussions in the 2040 plan about being seen as more helpful and, providing education, trying to make this people in the city understand that, preservation isn't about saying no, it's about helping you understand what you have and finding ways even to, we always focus in, people come before us when they're just in the districts, and there's the whole town, and there's so many amazing stories and resources across the whole town, and how can we provide services, because ultimately that's what people pay attention to you when you can help them and when you can give them something that they need. And so on 3 levels, I guess, you said in your resource manual you'll have some contacts and things like that. Are you guys doing anything to help us commissions and whatever kind of create a web of information and education that we can bounce off each other and offer to people in our cities on a local level? And then my other question, sort of related but unrelated, is who are the other states, like your agencies in other states across the nation that, if any, that are kind of sending the same message and doing these things? And then the final one, you mentioned the National Register, and I'm sure the federal tax credit and things like that are still a little bit stuck in kind of the national, review process that sometimes doesn't budge or waver too much. Is there any change going on at the national level? Because, the bottom line is incentives and tax credits and any other incentives can often get people's attention and make things happen too.
Thank you, Commissioner Sullivan. Good to see you. Great questions. Broad questions, so I'll do my best to respond succinctly. First question was just about being a resource, being a continued resource. Are there going to be are there going to be resources available to the public through this process, or that you can create that are available to the public? Number one, this is not the only time that you'll see me, just to say, thankfully, we're local and we can continue to have these conversations. And I know that the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions is doing this kind of work as well to support you as a commission. They just released the messaging guide, which is very helpful to think about the language around preservation and how to de-jargon what we're doing, and to think about it. So I just want to say that the resources are plentiful. It's trying to find them. And then if you want to consolidate them so that the citizens of Evanston can find them easily, or if you want to have links to other resources, but then of course it's making sure those links stay alive, and Cade has other things to do. So hopefully we will have this resource available at landmarks.org, but also this is a link to many other resources. But you've identified as here that there is no one central resource where we can point people to, which is, frustrating at times. There's also additional ways that I hope to support communities as they think about this, because it would not be very responsible to just bring up all sorts of challenges and not be here to work on the solutions. So I do hope that there are other conversations to be had to think through the complexities of bringing these ideas to the table. The National Trust for Historic Preservation is doing that with their own change-making agenda. To go to the National Park Service is also working on a process to think through the Secretary of the Interior standards, as well as I think they've just started the process to reconsider the criteria as well. So they have started their own process as well. The Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, which administers the federal program amongst the federal agencies, just put out a call for opinions about the Secretary of the Interior standards so that they themselves can evaluate this and give comments to the National Park Service. So it is happening. I would say that the federal agencies are seeing it. There are other statewide nonprofit and state historic preservation offices that are doing this work. Look to the state of California. Julianne Polanco, who's their SHPO officer, is the chair of the Climate Heritage Network, and thinking about this work from a sustainability standpoint. So I hope to continue to provide you with additional resources. So that's an attempt to get to all three of those questions. I've taken more of my time than I was supposed to have.
I was going to gently point that out. But I mean, this has been a great conversation. We're grateful to have you. Does anyone have any other burning questions that you brought with you that you feel that we should talk about?
Cade, would you do me the favor of putting up the next slide?
Oh.
That there, in your packet, there was a version of this. Apologies that there was one duplicate slide, so thank you, Cade, for putting up the most recent version of this. My contact information is here. I am happy to talk with you, to have small group conversations that do not break the open meetings law, so we'll make sure that that's done transparently with the public, but you can contact us in multiple ways and continue to ask questions. So I greatly appreciate this opportunity to talk with you, and I'd really love to hear what you think about how you would implement any of these ideas in Evanston with the Preserve 2040 plan.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The next item on the agenda is approval of, it's still called the approval of meeting minutes, but it's really just talking about them. The minutes from September 12th, 2023. Does anyone have any comments about the meeting minutes from last time? Okay, seeing none, we will take that as, we only have one page. Oh. Sorry. Give me a second here. Okay. We will assume that they are approved. Then the next item on the agenda is discussion. Item A is the Larimer Park concept plan. We have a presentation. Thank you very much.
Members of the committee, my name is Laura Biggs. I'm the city engineer, and I'm here tonight to show you a presentation of a project we have going on in the Ridge Historic District, where we are doing a full renovation of Larimer Park. So Larimer Park is located east of Ridge, between Dempster and Greenleaf Street. So it's just south of Dempster. It's actually on Crane. And so when you look, this is an existing viewpoint of Larimer Park, or existing aerial, and you can see the elements. It's a little hard to see on the screen, but we have a basketball court. This is a flexible field space, and there's a backstop that is in the southwest corner of the park. There's a pavilion, which is currently a building that has sliding panels that allow it to be completely enclosed in the winter so that it can be used as a warming center. It's no longer used that way, but there used to be pretty regularly ice skating in this park in the winter. There's a playground in the southeast corner, and in this area just north of the playground is sort of a tree grove, green area with some just flex space, again, that is used more as like a meditation area, I guess, for the lack of a better way to describe it. Next slide, please. This is actually our proposed concept design. Now, we've gone through 3 public meetings and done some public engagement to get to this location. This park is substantially the same as the existing park, so you would see mostly the same exact elements. There's a basketball court, flex space with a backstop. This warming building now, we are looking at to convert to just an open air shelter by removing the panels. The roofing and structure's in pretty good condition. The reason for that is, A, it's no longer used as a warming center. The panels lend to sort of a rundown appearance, and the panels have been subject to a lot of graffiti over the years, so it's really a challenge to keep it graffiti-free with the panels there. Then we also have a playground in roughly the same area and a tree grove in roughly the same area. So some of the improvements that are being made in addition to the change to the pavilion or shelter, we're providing some upgraded pathways to make this park a lot more ADA compliant, adding sidewalk around the cul-de-sac. We are redoing the basketball court to put into better condition. We're proposing to replace this backstop. The playground equipment would be all new. And there is some general tree modifications. I think the light green trees are the existing trees, and the dark green ones show new trees that would be planted. I believe there are a few removals that are going to happen of trees whose health is deteriorated and been recommended for removal by the arborist. Next slide, please. So in meeting with our community, and which it's an open public meeting, but we do notify the people that are within a couple block radius around the park, as this is considered a neighborhood park, that these meetings will be taking place. Here's an example of what this pavilion would look like once we remove the panels. The neighbors have really pushed for more of a nature play themed playground. It's a very traditional playground right now. They are looking to elements that are more like this, where will have some very specific playground equipment. They would like it more in some of the more muted tones of green and brown, with some elements like, in this case, there are what are really plastic or metal-based playground equipment that is in appearance similar to tree stumps. And so these are the kinds of elements that we're generally looking at putting into place. In return, there will be some fencing replacement. The existing fencing is a chain link. We'll be looking at our standard panel fencing, which is a black sort of wire panel that is relatively easy to maintain and has a higher level appearance than the chain link fence that we are generally replacing. And swing elements, we would be looking at installing a new park sign that is in compliance with our current standards for park signs. Previous park signs were a wood panel that had the name carved into it, and we've been gradually replacing those citywide with this more modern style park sign. Next slide. This is really just a survey plat of the playground and isn't substantially different from what I've previously shown you. But it is a plan sheet, unfortunately, that is very small text, so very difficult to read. So I'm not sure that really shows you anything additional. Next slide, please. And that's it. So I'm happy to entertain any questions, but we really did want to get feedback from the Preservation Commission, as this is a pretty major park renovation that is located within the historic district.
Does anyone you have questions? Go ahead.
So I have a question, because on the city website, there's a Larimer Park improvement page that shows the different iterations of the project over time. And the most recent plan on that is from June, and so this one is from, and so I'm just wondering, because there was the feedback from the last community meeting there was discussion about a backstop and the dog run, and it looks like that dog run has been removed and the backstop is put back, and I'm just wondering if the community is aware of that design change.
Yes, I apologize. Our website is clearly not up to date because I think we've had at least one, maybe two meetings since then. So that was a hot topic at the last public engagement meeting. In fact, I'd say it was probably the most excited topic at the last public engagement meeting. But generally the feeling was the backstop is more useful. There was a concern that while people do walk their dog in the park, the space that was being allocated for a dog run was relatively small and would not readily be used by the people walking their dogs. There's also a proposal within this same ward that is represented on the proposed 2024 capital program to consider the installation of a dog park at Gray Park, which is really just a few blocks from this location. And so people felt like it wasn't really a necessary element at this particular park location and would be underutilized.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to know how, I'm just unfamiliar with how this works, how they prioritize which parks are getting addressed. Is there like a list of parks that have the most need, or is it by ward? Every ward gets a part, like how does this work for when you guys think about which parks you're going to upgrade, renovate? What's that process look like?
There was a park scorecard that evaluated the quality of the infrastructure in the parks that was done approximately 6 or 7 years ago. And from that, it identified a list of worst parks, and this is on that list. We've been doing typically one full park renovation a year. We've also, because these full park renovations are expensive, we've been doing a lot of internal analysis to see if there's a better way. And as we've gathered our own internal data, what we've put together is there are approximately 11 parks in the city that haven't had any significant infrastructure investment over the last 26 years. And most park elements don't have a life that extends 26 years typically. And so we are finding this list of what we are referring to as legacy parks that we need to clean up as typically the very worst parks. So they are a little bit scattered around the city, but there are at least a couple in the 4th Ward. And so we've been kind of doing as like the worst ones first and doing that. We'd like to get away from that policy, and to that end, we actually do have a park strategic plan that is going through and looking at our parks in general and determining what's a better way in terms of prioritizing parks and which parks should we be addressing? There's some discrepancy in how parklands and playgrounds are distributed around the city. So not everybody has equal access to walkable playgrounds. So that is expected to be finished up in February or so. So I would expect that when we do next year's capital program, we would have a better sense of how to move forward strategically with these park replacements.
Great. I just had one other quick thing. You mentioned ADA compliance on the walkways. I was just curious if there was any ADA, features, I guess, of the play space for kids. Like if there are swings, if there are like special swings, or like how you guys think about the play space that the kids are on.
Yes, play spaces are generally, I don't know the exact rules because I'm not a certified playground designer. And unfortunately, our landscape architect was out of town for this meeting, but you are supposed to have a certain percentage of your play elements to be ADA compliant. And the surfacing that you use on the ground around the play area has to be of a certain type of surfacing. Now, we usually use a combination of like that rubber surfacing as well as mulch, but the mulch is actually very specifically designed to be ADA compliant, called it engineered wood fiber in our terms. So we make the surfacing fully ADA compliant, but that usually does include that engineered wood fiber. Then a certain percentage of swings are designed to be ADA compliant, and a certain percentage of the playground elements on the equipment are also expected to be able to be utilized by somebody in a wheelchair with a disability.
Just sorry, one follow-up. You mentioned the engineered wood. That's different than that like ground-up tire stuff that you know what I'm talking, that,
Yes. So
or that,
there's
that spongy tire remnant, I don't know exactly what it is, but.
we typically do not use the spongy tire stuff in our playgrounds.
Okay, good.
I do not know if it is ADA compliant because I'm not an expert in that. I could certainly find out, but there's a lot of reasons why we don't use it. But one of the reasons why we use engineered wood fiber quite a lot is because most of our engineered wood fiber, if not all, is really from Evanston trees that have reached the end of their useful life. We hire a vendor that comes to actually we have a public works yard behind the sled hill in James Park, and they take those trees and put them into, through equipment to make sure that the engineered wood fiber meets the specifications that would qualify it as a safety surface and for ADA compliance.
That's good. Yeah, I'm glad you're doing that because that ground-up tire is not considered good material. Kids kind of inhale it sometimes, and it's got a lot of chemicals. So that would be my preference. So thank you.
So we just sat through this amazing presentation about telling stories, and the idea of the trees here. So I was on a bike ride near the Ecology Center last week, and the person I was with asked if we could stop because there was a tree there that was dedicated to his brother who was deceased, and he wanted to share that with me. And so I'm wondering if there's some way to incorporate that kind of like dedication with the trees or something to give people an opportunity to have connections here in this park. Has that come up at all in your conversations with folks?
It has not. That hasn't been a request that we've received in this location. Public Works does work with people that want to dedicate a tree, but they've generally located them in places like the Ladd Arboretum to really have specific areas where trees can be dedicated. It makes it easier for our staff to manage the dedicated tree population.
It's an opportunity to let people tell their stories and have connections with this place that's deeper and more closer to who they are. So it's just an idea that we might float.
No, thank you for that feedback. I will bring that back to our Public Works group.
I got two questions, I guess. First of all, how was your thought process, or how was the design process influenced by the fact that the park is within historic district?
So our first, in all honesty, it wasn't something that was taken into account very much. Our process is to go to the public and say, here's your existing park, and it's got these deficiencies, and then show them pictures of a variety of parks to see how that might spur some conversation. And then we take the conversation of like, what would you like to see in a new Larimer Park? And then we bring that back to them with some concepts, usually 3 concepts that are very different from each other, and let them pick and pull those apart, tell us what they like and don't like, and then we land on 1 or 2 concepts to get for the final conversations and final it out. And there we're just dealing like really specific elements on that last one, like dog park or no dog park, there's not enough slides, like just really down to nitty-gritty. In this particular case, we showed people lots of variety of parks. They've landed on a park that is very, very similar, which is what happens 95% of the time when you ask people what they want with their park. The sky, if you give them a sky's the limit, they really want the park they have. They just want it in better condition and modernized. But the staff is more aware of the historic preservation requirements. And so we are, as we finalize down into the final thing, what we would like to see is like, as staff, we don't necessarily want to recommend a neon green play equipment in a historic district. We want to look at things that we feel like will blend in more with the neighborhood. It so happened that we didn't have to do a lot of guiding in this particular case because it turns out very similar. And I will say the one thing that we were concerned about most with this particular one was the shelter and how was that going to play out. Again, what the community was selecting was really what fit well with the historic district, so we didn't push any particular ideas. I think what we would normally find with a park is if we were finding that there was some really radical request by the community, we would want to be bringing that here more further up the food chain and hearing the thoughts of historic preservation more in advance.
And I also wanted to, do you know, or do you think the staff knows who Larimer was and when the park was created?
So I apologize in that I do not know Larimer Park. I think our project manager has more information on that.
I believe it's the site of a former school, the Larimer School. It was designed by Daniel Burnham. A very significant building that was taken down at some point in time. But it is certainly a site that has a story to tell. I don't, its recent memory and recent history, I think, is more tied to it being a park, and I would say the kind of the spirit of that place is more associated with a park and a place of play. But it does have a backstory as well.
One item that's really interesting when you go into these community parks is that they are such an extension of people's backyards, and they feel very personal about them. And so the stuff that people do in their backyards, that's what people want in their park. And you really see it used as like that neighborhood gathering place where people are showing up on weekends, in the evenings. People who walk dogs regularly meet each other there. Moms that have toddlers that they're taking to play in the mornings during, school hours, they're meeting there. So you really find that's true in this park as well as most of our neighborhood parks, that they really become these informal gathering spaces where the community can connect with each other.
Kate, do we ever, or have we ever in any parks, or maybe you know this, put up a plaque or something or some sign that tells the story, like this used to be the site of this, and then...
I think the only example I can think of is McCullough Park has some information.
We do it we usually do it more when there's such a thing that already exists or when the council member of the ward takes a strong interest. knowing what you have indicated, I mean, it is definitely something that we could look at doing and integrating into the park. If that is the recommendation, I understand that this is a historic location and we want to be sensitive to that.
I think it'd be nice to, like, take back and ask and consider, I mean, on the theme of our evening, if it's a creative way to start telling the stories of our neighborhoods across the city, you know, as we're renovating these parks and things, incorporating something about the history of Evanston in this location.
Especially with the more modern signage that you all are going towards, there might be a chance on the back of that sign, depending on where it is or whatever, just to be able to partner, you know, if we could partner with the park district and help inform that at all, you know, just being able to tell those stories. Yeah, it's fresh on our minds, of course. Being able to tell those stories in places of play and what they used to be or how long they'd been a park or what the park used to look like or just a lot of opportunities there.
Well, we are the park district for this particular
Right, that's
park.
why I'm like, yes, let's do
So
it.
you're just partnering with us.
Yes,
And,
definitely.
but that, yeah, that's something that we can look into, and I can reach out to the History Center and see if they have some information that we could utilize.
I would say another option, if it can't be integrated into the sign, from my perspective, would be when you are renovating the pavilion, there might be an opportunity there in some way to mount some images or a plaque or something, some information.
Yeah, I'm not sure that integrating it in the back of the sign is really our best opportunity because that really doesn't highlight the information if you're going to the trouble to do this. I feel like it's a much better use of our time to find a better location to somehow highlight that. But yeah, I will take these suggestions and we will see what we can integrate. And so when this goes to City Council for approval, where we are is that we are finalizing the design currently, and we will be going out to bid for construction for 2024. I shouldn't say it that way. We are finalizing the concept plan. We did not want to do that without coming to historic preservation. Once that's finalized, we'll go into design this winter for 2024 construction. That's still true. So we can incorporate that element in. I'll also work with the council member of the ward, and we can then, as part of the dedication, then we would put in an element that when we finish construction and we have an opening ceremony or dedication, we can highlight it at that point.
I just wanted to add, if it makes sense, if it's not a plaque, but some text and maybe an image. If there was an image, if it sounds like Burnham, there was a school that Burnham built, if it's significant, that could be possibly included with the text, just because not everyone reads everything. It's a picture draws people in.
I wouldn't mind going back a little bit beyond, back into history a little bit beyond the Burnham, you know, to see what else might have happened in that piece of land. Farther back in time.
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about that, it would be kind of an interesting thing to talk about the geological setting of, you know, where it is, because it's right next to Ridge, and, you know, that used to be the historic lake shore, and so, you know, I think for kids that would be kind of an interesting thing, you know, as they're playing in the playground, to realize that, oh, what is now Lake Michigan used to be all the way up to, you know, to Ridge, and, you know, as they're playing in the sandbacks, you know, they're maybe hoping that they're going to find a fossil or something. I don't know, but, you know, it's just, you know, it's an interesting thing that you could include.
The context for our conversation is this idea that, you know, so many sites are associated with, that there aren't very many that are acknowledged to be significant beyond their connection to, you know, buildings and stuff. So maybe we can try to spread that out a little bit more, go back a little bit farther.
I just want to add to that, we just had Indigenous Peoples Day, like,
Yeah.
like a land acknowledgement of some sort. I mean, I don't know if that's what you're getting at,
That's what I'm
but
getting at.
like, obviously this land was originally, native peoples here. I don't know if you're going to do a write-up, maybe that's, that would be listed in there as part of the history of the park lands.
Yeah, I mean, I think just, now we're adding everything. But I mean, the point being, just because we're preservation, we aren't just saying link it to a building or something.
Right.
Like truly
That's-
the history and the culture of this point in Evanston, which I think is phenomenal, when you're next to a playground in an educational space, It'd be maybe a nice thing that we could start with all our renovations. And,
We're not talking about a novel here and covering every space of the pavilion, but just, making sure that that we're telling stories of places that aren't just about the building that used to be there, even if that's where the name comes from, or maybe especially because that's where the name comes from. So we don't have any action, right? We're just giving feedback. So do you have the feedback? Was there anybody else that had any questions? Okay. Do you have the feedback that you need from us?
Yes, that was
Okay.
very helpful, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
It's a lovely project. Thank you, Laura.
Okay, moving on in the agenda then. Okay. I need to just. Yeah, let's talk about the agenda and then. So then the next item on the agenda is the October newsletter. Staff is going to provide us with an update. I'm going to let him warn you.
A very quick update. The newsletter is going to go out next Friday. I have most of the content already. I'm waiting on one commissioner who was in here to send me some information, and I think we're in good shape. If anyone had anything really pressing that they wanted to get in, I guess, speak now or forever hold your peace until the next one. But we are on target to release it next week.
Great, and as a reminder, that's the new quarterly newsletter that we've had one that was just welcome to the newsletter, so this is our first one after that. So we're trying, for those of you who are new commissioners, if you want to suggest some stuff for the newsletter, feel free. And then we do have, just very briefly, some new commissioners here tonight. If you want to just say hi, tell us your name.
Hi, my name is Thomas Altman, and I'm very, very honored to be here. Thank you.
Yes, of course. Charles?
My name is Charles Smith, and I also am very happy to be here. I'm excited about this process, and this evening was absolutely wonderful. Thanks to you. Thank you very much for that presentation. A great introduction to to being on the commission. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We are going to call this meeting adjourned. It is 8:38 p.m. Thank you. Good night.